Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. We have a beautiful day here in Alabama. 93 degrees, but beautiful. It's 93 here underneath the shade house. The framework of the 60% shade cloth is doing a great job. Great job. The plants are doing wonderful. They're just growing and growing and growing, and I'm just feeding them and feeding them and feeding them. We've been outside for about 3 weeks now, and since the day I put them outside, we have not gotten a drop of rain. Not a single drop of rain. The only moisture these guys have gotten, they've gotten from me. Sorry for my bad English. They haven't gotten a single drink unless it's been given from me. I come out in the morning and spray, and then I usually spray in the evening too. I don't have to spray them that much, but they're all nice and plump and fat and doing great and growing like crazy, so I'm trying to make sure there's nutrients around them all the time. I mixed up some nutrients over here. I didn't put it on camera. Mixing nutrients is not something everybody wants to see, I don't believe. I've got a few plants that I just started putting in there. I used calcium nitrate, Jax, and Epsom salts, and kelp and seaweed this time. I wrote it down so everybody would, it helps because I know everybody's going to ask questions, but these are the amounts: calcium nitrate, Jax, Epsom salts, kelp and seaweed, and even my rainwater, which was 3 parts per million. Always make sure you add in your rainwater, your tap water, your RO water, whatever water you're using, distilled water, etc. Check it with your meter. 178 parts per million is what this mix is right now. Now it's a little high for what I normally feed, but I'm going to be diluting this down here shortly with some, and I wanted it that high because I'm going to be using this for a foiler feed later on. So I take about 2/3 of a container, or about 3/4 of a gallon into my sprayer, and then the rest of it I fill with just regular rainwater, so it dilutes it down a little bit, but it goes a little bit farther for me. But this is what I'm feeding at the moment. What I wanted to point out was what I consider kelp and seaweed and the Epsom salts. I really consider those supplements. I don't feed them all the time, although I am feeding the kelp and seaweed almost every single time I feed now. But that's something I'll discuss more. Epsom salts, I only give them Epsom salts when they need it. Most of the mottling and discoloration and chlorosis that I had on the leaves, little spotting and stuff like that, pretty much has gone away. There's only a couple plants left that have a little bit on it, and they're heading in the right direction, so I'm not that concerned about the magnesium. They got a little bit of magnesium in this one, only 20 parts per million, and that's normally what I feed of these two supplements, typically 15 to 20 parts per million, and sometimes they just happen to be fed both at the same time. I don't feed on any type of schedule. I would let the plants tell me what they want. Now the kelp and seaweed, I'm probably going to start feeding every time I feed, since they're outside and they're growing so strong. But what I wanted to point out was when I talk about my nutrient mix and I talk about my percentage of calcium nitrate, this is what I'm talking about. This is my nutrient mix. Those are supplements. I don't add them all the time. But when this gets added all the time, my Jax 5-12-26 and the calcium nitrate, I use that all the time. If you'll notice, at this point, my calcium nitrate, which is the most important part here, the nitrogen is the energy for the growth. And this one has 15% nitrogen and 18% calcium, so it's a little bit of a stronger 1-to-1 ratio, perfect for orchids. But it's 70 parts per million, and the Jax is 70 parts per million, so my calcium nitrate is 50% of my mix right now. So when I talk about my nutrient mix, my percentage of calcium nitrate, that's what I'm referring to. Right now I'm feeding at 50%. As we get further into summer and the days get longer and longer and the temperatures increase and the light gets more intense, and like I said, the duration of light, the days get longer, I'll start increasing the calcium nitrate bit by bit. I'm already up to 50% now. I was feeding more around 30-35% in the wintertime. Now I'm feeding more around 50%, and it'll start going up over the next few weeks, just bit by bit. Every couple of weeks I'll start going up a little bit on it. The Jax will follow suit, but the calcium nitrate will be the stronger of the two nutrients, between now and probably the end of summer. Anyway, that's what I'm feeding. I hope that answers those questions. The kelp and seaweed is really what I wanted to talk about, and I got to remind everybody, these are just my opinions, my take on things. This is just my 2 cents I'm putting into here. I have no education with plants. No, I'm not a botanist, biologist. I don't have any degrees in biology or anything like that. I'm a structural engineer by trade. I've said this before. This is just my take on things, and I like to do research and I like to read. A lot of the information that I get on talking about kelp and seaweed comes from First Rays. He's a great source for it, his website. And there's a lot of information, a lot of research been done with Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, and other orchids, and that's kind of where I get my information from. It's just a lot of reading. Orchid books don't really give me a lot. It's more of the experiments that I see with the Asian commercial companies doing more than anything. They give a really good research. But I wanted to talk mainly about the kelp and seaweed today. Hormones. It's been, I guess, I'm gonna sit down here so I can hold the camera a little bit more steady. I've been growing orchids for a little over 2 years, and this is my third summer to put them outside, actually. But I've been growing for a little over 2 years, and I tell people all the time I'm still new to orchids, and I am. I really am. And again, this is just my take on things, but I think understanding how the plants grow, the actual concept of how orchids grow, I think is one of the big things for understanding how to take care of our own orchids and feed them. I also feel that just like when I realized how important calcium was to orchids, what an eye-opener that was, and what a difference it made in my orchid collection and how they're growing. I also have now realized just how important, and I've known for a while, but just now putting my thoughts together on it, but just how important hormones are to orchids and for them to grow correctly. You can give them all the nutrients in the world and all the best nutrients in the world and all the calcium even included, but without hormones, and that's why I'm talking about kelp and seaweed, that stuff is full of growth hormones. Without those supplemental hormones, these plants don't grow correctly. And this goes right back to understanding how orchids grow in nature and thinking about, I always say if you're confused about something or have a question or wonder, ask those why questions. Those are the best things, is ask why all the time. But always go back to Mother Nature for the answers. Why, orchids don't get kelp and seaweed in the wild typically hanging on trees. Maybe a few that live near the ocean or something maybe, but they don't normally get kelp and seaweed. But what we're doing is we're providing extra hormones. Orchids hanging on trees in the wild would get not just nutrients dripped on them all the time through the sap and through the other fauna and animals that would pass through the trees above and stuff. It's not just all that would drip on the trees. And the trees are always sloughing off nutrients. They're always giving stuff off, always. They're living tissues, so they're always absorbing and then dropping it back off. Dead mounts is completely different. It's just a place for a plant to anchor to. They don't get any nutrition from that at all. Live wood is live trees, live wood where orchids mainly grow. They don't normally grow on dead wood. They normally grow on live wood, live trees. It's because that's where the nutrients are. They have a constant supply around them all the time. But they would be dripped on, hormones would be dripped on them all the time that would be given off by these plants and fauna and other animals that would move around above them. And it would eventually, rain would mix it up and move it down around them. Once and I still don't understand completely how they work, but I know that they make the biggest difference in the growth of the plants. They're just as equally as important as calcium, if not more so, and probably more so. Hormones, just like in people, control the growth of the plants. Hormones are influenced by light and temperature, and in turn tell the plant what to do based on the light and temperature. Take for example, and I want to try and talk about how it relates back to orchids every time I mention something. If I talk about auxins, or mention something that auxins do, I want to kind of connect it back to the orchids themselves if I can, and give examples of them if I can. I'm going to try to during this discussion, and this is probably going to go longer than 30 minutes, which means I'm going to watch my timer here and I'm going to cut it off and hopefully talk in a second part about this, or talk again about this, because there's so much to talk about here. Orchids hanging on trees would have all this stuff naturally dripped on them. All the nutrients and the hormones and stuff would drip on them. If I take my plants and put them outside, and they're outside now, but if I move under trees, they're outside under a canopy, but they're not actually under trees all around me, but not above them. If I move them underneath the trees, where they would get dripped on and they would get fed, and I wouldn't have to feed these guys all summer, and they would do wonderfully. And this is why when you see people, and I'm not faulting the people in South Florida or warm places, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, etc., that can put their plants outside, California, that can keep your orchids outside year-round. But if you're in an area where you can keep your plants year-round, keeping them on a patio is much, much different than keeping them underneath trees or attached to trees, where they would naturally get fed and have calcium around them all the time. In the wild, orchids, I'm trying to think how to make it sound right. It's like they live at a buffet table, like they have a seat at a buffet table. They always have food around them, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, 365 days a year. They have food around them, and they can pick and choose. Now, at certain times of the year, they may not have the variety. The buffet may be a little bit leaner, but they always, always, always have food around them. So they don't eat every Monday or every 2 weeks like it says on the back of the fertilizer bags to feed them. Feed them twice a month or every once a week, weekly or something. That's not how they feed. They feed all day long. They have 100, or 1,000 or 200, or something, snacks a day. A little tidbit here, a little tidbit there, a little bite here, a little bite here, a little morsel here, a little morsel there, a little nosh here, a little nosh there. They eat all day long, continually, and that would include hormones. Now, they produce their own hormones, but supplemental hormones, I think, are one of the reasons orchids grow the way they do, and I think that's overlooked, and it's certainly not talked about or discussed that much. I know. I can't find anything on people discussing it or talking about it too much. Hormones control how the plants grow, and orchids, they have such unique growth habits that hormones are more important, I think, for them than other plants. And you have to keep in mind, these same plants growing on the trees, orchids can only absorb what's actually on their roots or what's right adjacent to their roots. They can't absorb things that are ½ inch away or 1/4 inch away. There has to be a lot of moisture, a lot of water involved, and capillary action involved before they can start pulling nutrients to their cells. So because of that, they feed very quickly, and then they have to have it replenished, and then they feed again. So anytime it rains or like the dew would get heavy or something, it would move nutrients around and allow them to feed again and feed again. Because they feed often, they rely on that. And I'm not faulting people who have schedules and only feed once a week or once every 2 weeks or something like that. We have to make these things live in our environment too. We have to make concessions, and they have to make concessions to be able to adapt in our environment as well, with our work habits and everything else. But understanding how they grow and use their nutrients and get their nutrients and how often, I think, is super important. And again, this is just my take on things, my 2 cents. I think these guys feed nonstop, continually, tiny little amounts, all the time. And that's how I tell everybody how I'm trying to feed mine, is low amounts, all the time, often. It's one of the reasons I'm in gravel, pea gravel, river rock, lava rock, which is another video I'm way behind on talking about. But it's because I can control it never gets too wet. It never gets so soggy like moss or bark does. It never does. I can feed them in the morning, and I can feed them again in the evening. And I can do that every single day if I want to. And right now I'm having to, because I'm the only one. Mother Nature is providing tons and tons of beautiful sunshine and this glorious breeze we have, but she hasn't turned on the water yet for me. She will. But meanwhile, I'm just spraying. Now I've got some nutrients over here I've mixed up. And I keep the nutrients mixed over here for a reason. One, I can throw mounts in here. Mounts can always use some extra moisture and some extra nutrients. Always. So I throw in a handful of mounts during the daytime, and every time I walk by here, I take a handful out and put some fresh ones in here. Same with the pots. I have some that are growing super, super strong, have lots and lots of new growths. Those guys are getting an extra soak in here just to give them a little bit of extra boost. Hormones are so important for their growth as well. If you have a large collection, and even think about the people you see on YouTube that have large collections, orchid growers, and I'm not picking on anybody here, but they'll always have a handful of plants that absolutely just do wonderful. Then they have a bunch of plants that, they're doing not quite as well, but pretty good. And then they always have some that struggle. Always just seem to struggle. And there's certain orchids that they just cannot keep alive, and just always seem to lose. They get one and they lose it. They always have a trouble with them. I watch these people, and they're using good fertilizers. They're good growers. They're giving their plants lots of good sunlight. They're giving their plants the best water. they're not burning them with high amounts of nutrients or anything, but what's missing? Why would they have plants doing that? Why? We have so many different varieties of plants in our collections. Some of these guys might need a little more hormones than the rest of them. Some of them, I think, rely on hormones a lot more than some of the others. I think a lot of it has to do with how the plants are shaped and their, where they live, etc., how they grow. Plants, I've noticed that like Phalaenopsis and Vandas, plants that don't have big bulbs or canes, big storage vessels for nutrients, also I guess apparently don't get to store hormones, and so they're low on hormones all the time, and they stall if they don't have hormones around them on a continual basis. I have no doubt that the big bloom that I got this past fall in all my Phalaenopsis was because of all the kelp and seaweed that I was giving them all summer long. All that supplemental hormone, really, it's not that I artificially stimulated them. I artificially trigger them to grow all these bloom spikes and everything for me. No. At first I was afraid I was doing that, but I think what it does is all I did was I allowed the plants to take advantage of all the nutrients I was giving them. I allowed them to become orchids and grow like they normally would. When you see orchids in the wild growing on trees, they're covered in blooms and lots of flower spikes, but we never get that kind of growth and that kind of stuff in our grow rooms, in our little greenhouses, in our porches, in our kitchen counters, basements, and our shelving. We don't get that kind of growth. It's because we're not giving them exactly everything they would get hanging on the trees. The more often you can feed them, and again, that's why I like my nutrients, my media, because I can feed them all the time. So the more often you can feed them, the more often they're getting nutrients, but they're also getting those hormones all the time. Hormones tell the plant what to do based on the temperature and the light. I keep going back to this and back to that. Auxins and cytokinins, two of the most important hormones that you find a lot of that stuff in the kelp and seaweed. A lot of it in the kelp and seaweed. Let me back up here. I've got some notes because there's just so much of this stuff to remember. And I don't want to miss any of it because it's all really, really good stuff. Like I said, you can feed them all the best nutrients in the world, but if you've got some plants that are just never done real well for you or stalled, or still stalled, and you've even started giving them more calcium, you'll notice a better growth out of them, but they still aren't growing 100%. And a lot of people, they just kind of chalk it up with, well, I think this is just a bad specimen. You get 100 clones, you're going to get one bad one, right? I mean, I agree with that. I agree with that logic, but I'm telling you, there's something missing in our growing habits. There's something that we're not giving these guys, and you notice a huge difference. I started giving these guys more kelp now, kelp and seaweed, since I brought them outside, and I'm able to spray them. It's easier for me to, and it's not so much for the extra potassium as it is for those growth hormones. Is why I like that kelp and seaweed. It has lots of those growth hormones in it. Some of the types of kelp and seaweed that are in that stuff grow several feet a day. Incredible growth hormones that are in there. Auxins. One of the things auxins is responsible for is root initiation. It initiates the root process in orchids. Root elongation, root branching, enlarging the thickness of roots, increasing number of root tips. Auxins responsible for that. Rooting compounds that you find, commercial rooting compounds that are sold, typically are organic or synthetic auxins. You dip your cuttings and stuff in it and plant them in dirt, peat moss or whatever, those plugs or whatever, and they grow roots. Auxins stimulates the plant and tells the plant to grow roots. It's a hormone. Like I said before, these guys produce their own hormones, but I think orchids rely on supplemental hormones because of how they grow. I think they also rely on being dripped on all those extra hormones. And in our enclosed environments, we don't do that. They don't get that, and so they don't grow 100% right. When you give them the kelp and seaweed, and especially if you're spraying it on them, they just seem to get all, what was that movie, Jumanji? They turn into, they go all Jumanji on you. They get all jungle-like. Roots just grow crazy. We'll get into it. Root initiation, root elongation, root branching, the enlarging and thickness of roots, increasing number of root tips, auxins. Auxins are produced in the new shoots of the plant. The plant starts getting new canes or bulbs or leaves. It produces auxins up there. The auxins are distributed back down through the shoots, through the new leaves, through the new canes, bulbs, into the plant, and the auxins there tell the plant, we got a lot happening up on top. We got a lot of new growth up on top. Start growing roots. We need extra roots to support all this upper growth, this new canopy growth. So start growing roots. It's responsible for root initiation. It tells your plants to start growing roots. Auxins do. Add 10 drops of kelp and seaweed to a gallon of water and 10 drops of calmec to a gallon of water, and take that rescue phalaenopsis or that rootless cane or that rootless cattleya bulb or that rootless oncidium bulb and soak it in that. Let them sit and soak it in that, or water its moss and bark with that mixture and watch what happens. Those auxins will tell the plant to start producing roots. And the calcium will allow it to start producing roots. All right? Auxins. Auxins helps with leaf expansion, helps with the cambium activity, the vessels that run through the plant to absorb moisture and distribute it back through the plant. It creates not just larger vessels, larger tube-like structures, but more of them too, so the plant's able to pull in more moisture and more nutrients. Cell elongation and cell enlargement, auxins are responsible for that as well. And I've mentioned this one before. Have you ever seen the grapes in the grocery store they look like little fat, short green fingers? They're real long, elongated instead of being little round grapes. Those are grapes that have been usually sprayed with synthetic or organic auxins. Create cell elongation, cell enlargement, so they get a larger mass of fruit on the vine. They're selling it by the pound, remember. So it increases the size of the fruit. You get larger bunches of grapes, so they get a better price, more weight on the vine per se. And I guess it's allowed, but auxins are responsible for that. Have you ever seen somebody's collection? They bring out a cattleya that's got these massive fat bulbs, these big giant fat bulbs, and you're just like, wow, how do they get such huge fat bulbs on them? Hormones. Big oncidiums that have these big basketball shaped little bulbs. Hormones are responsible for that. It tells the plants what to do based on what the temperature and the light. Now hormones will tell the plant to do something until it starts growing, but if you don't have adequate nutrients there at the same time, you may have failed growth. They may not grow correctly. If the nutrients are there and you don't have hormones, the plants are not going to grow correctly either. All the nutrients in the world won't make up for the lack of hormones. It won't know what to do. That's why when you have people with a larger collection, you notice there's quite a bit of variance. You have a lot of plants that do real well and some that do a little bit less well and some that do always seem to struggle. I think the difference there is hormones. You're feeding a good nutrients, you're giving lots of light, you're giving good water. What could be missing? Hormones. All right. Cytokins. Cytokins is another one that's super, super important. Cytokins are produced in the root tips, and it creates this little circle of growth. The new shoots that start to grow produce auxins. The auxins are sent back down and tell the plant to grow roots. The roots start growing, the roots produce cytokins. Cytokins are responsible for shoot multiplication and cell division. How many times have you seen somebody pull out a cattleya or dendrobium, and instead of having that one shoot, it's got like 5-6 shoots coming out of it? Now the plant has to be mature enough and be fed properly to do that, but you can feed them all the best nutrients in the world and give them all the best care in the world, and without those hormones, you won't get those multiple shoots and that multiple cell division like that. It just won't happen. That's how you get that. That's how they do that in the wild. That's how they grow like that in the wild, because they get the hormones dripped on them. Now they're producing their own, but orchids need those supplemental hormones. I think they've learned to, and over the eons they've developed a relationship with getting hormones dripped on them all the time, and when they don't get them in our enclosed environments, I keep using that term, enclosed environments, I think they suffer, they struggle, they can't grow like they would normally grow. Now we're not encouraging them to do something artificially that they normally wouldn't do. We're not creating multiple branches and multiple spikes and multiple blooms and multiple shoots when they normally wouldn't. No, they won't do it if they don't have the proper nutrition. But if you're giving them lots of nutrition and then you start giving them hormones, you're going to notice all of a sudden that they go crazy with growth. It allows them to finally become jungle plants and grow naturally. Cytokins increase nitrogen uptake, which stops and slows senescence. Senescence is when they eat those lower leaves, when they, like a phalaenopsis, drops those lower leaves, or they eat a flower spike, or the dendrobiums eat their lower leaves on the old canes or old bulbs. What they're doing is they're relocating mobile nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, things like that, mobile nutrients. They relocate them to another part of their self that's growing. And the part that they took the nutrients from usually starts to die back. That's called senescence. Cytokinins tell the plant to suck up more nutrients and pull in more nitrogen, increases their nitrogen intake, which in turn slows down senescence and keeps it from happening as often. My plants are doing much, much better since I've been doing that. It encourages bud and flower development, which I have no doubt, like I was talking about at the beginning, that the bloom that I got, I think it was because of all those hormones that I was giving my plants. Again, I didn't artificially stimulate them to grow multiple spikes. It just allowed them to. They would have normally done that in the wild hanging on trees, but instead I got it in my living room, or my my sunroom and in my grow room last year. But I still have some plants down there that are still blooming since last November, and they're still getting a lot of nitrogen. Still getting lots of nitrogen, still getting lots of hormones. They're being fed and fed and fed. Cytokinins increases the leaf surface and the size of the leaves. Raise your hand if you got a phalaenopsis that doesn't grow the leaves the right size. The leaves never get as big as they used to be. You're feeding lots of nutrients. You're giving them good sunlight. You're using good water, but their leaves don't seem to grow the size that they're supposed to. Or you have canes that don't get as big as they're supposed to, bulbs that don't get as large as the previous ones or the original ones on the plant, and you're feeding good nutrients, you're giving them lots of light. Hormones. Cytokinins. Again, I'm just scratching the surface here to pique some curiosity, hopefully, and get some people thinking. We'll talk about it again. Cytokinins influence cell division, like those unnamed cells, those virgin cells that don't have a purpose yet. It tells them to become either a stem, a root, a leaf, a flower bud, or a spike. Cytokinins. It increases a plant's girth and thickness. Cytokinins. It influences cell division, increases new shoot development, and quicker, stronger growth. Wow, just crazy stuff. And that's just some of the things I wanted to mention. Hormones, kelp and seaweed, how important it is. It's the hormones is what we're looking for. It's not so much the kelp and seaweed, it's the hormones that are in it. And that little teeny tiny trace of potassium this time of year is not going to be bad. And that's how you want to get potassium, is 0.5% or 1%. Very tiny, tiny amounts like that. Tiny, tiny amounts. The response I'm getting on my plants is multiple shoots, multiple branching, lots and lots of roots. One of the first things people tell me when they start using kelp and seaweed is, I've got old roots that look like dead, old, withered roots that all of a sudden start putting out green root tips out the side of them. They just start branching off root tips from all over the place. That's one of the first things you'll notice, one of the first things you'll hear back. Response. Tremendous stuff. Feed often, tiny amounts, as often as you possibly can. You'll notice I don't keep trays underneath my plants. I have one or two, but that's actually to slow down the evaporation and slow down the airflow. I don't keep trays under my plants because I want the airflow. The quicker they dry out, the more often I can feed them. It might be a little more work for me, but the plants is what it benefits. You know, I'm growing right now for that bloom for this fall. I'm growing for the bloom this fall. You're always growing for what's coming down the road, remember? So we've got to fatten these guys up, get them ready, and pump them full of hormones so they feel their natural selves and can grow like they should. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my evening. That's just a little quick talk on hormones. We'll hit it again, I promise. Good stuff. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, as always, everybody. And have a great evening.